We get a lot of that convective heat off those rocks, and you'll lose a lot of that in the fall and then in the winter time.
It just feels different than when you're in the city.
We don't have a whole lot of shade out here, very few trees. There's no moisture out here to keep the cool temperature down.
The high desert of Nevada is a land of sun-bleached bones and cracked earth, where water is a memory, and the wind carries only the scent of dust.
There were beaver here, and they were widespread and common across this landscape. The northern Great Plains evolved with beaver, these stream systems evolved with beaver, and they're a natural part of these systems.
We tried to fix it with concrete and permits, only to watch the green lines on the map vanish. Then, we stepped aside for 5 beavers with orange teeth and a singular obsession. What followed wasn't just a biological fluke, it was a hydrological revolution written in mud and sticks. A dying land. Before Nevada desert's resurrection, how did its landscape die? It is rarely a sudden collapse. Rather, it is a slow, rhythmic hemorrhaging of life. In the high desert of the Great Basin, this death is defined by a process called stream incision. For over a century, the waterways of Nevada, Susie Creek, Maggie Creek, and their unnamed tributaries have been transforming from life-giving arterial systems into deep, dry scars. To the untrained eye, these arroyos, or gullies, look like natural features of a rugged terrain. In reality, they are the architectural evidence of an ecological vacuum. The death of the land began with the removal of the biological heartbeat of the American West, the beaver. Long before the first cattle were driven across the sagebrush, or the first silver mines were bored into the mountains, millions of beavers managed the continent's water. They were the primary architects of the landscape, building millions of small, leaky dams that slowed the flow of water, trapped sediment, and forced the mountain runoff to spread across the valley floors. When the fur trade swept across the West in the early 19th century, beavers were trapped to near extinction. Within a few decades, the master engineers were gone, and the beaverless era began. Without the constant maintenance of these small dams, the plumbing of the desert failed. When the snowmelt came rushing down from the Independence Mountains in the spring, there were no structures to break its momentum. Water is a sculptor of immense power. When it moves fast, it carries soil. Without beaver dams to check the speed of the current, the water began to bite into the soft valley floors. This is the phenomenon of incision. Instead of spilling over its banks to nourish the surrounding meadows, the water carved a deeper and deeper trench. Year by year, the stream bed dropped, 1 foot, 5 feet, then 10. The result was a hydrological disaster hidden in plain sight. As the stream channel deepened, it acted like a giant drain pipe for the entire valley. In the arid West, the water table, the level of saturated ground beneath our feet, is tied directly to the height of the stream. When the stream bed drops 10 feet into a vertical gully, the groundwater in the surrounding fields drops 10 feet to match it. Almost overnight, in geological terms, the lush riparian sponges that once defined the Nevada basins were dewatered. The vibrant ribbons of green, the willows, the sedges, and the deep-rooted aspens could no longer reach the receding water. They died off, replaced by the hardy silver-gray sagebrush and invasive cheatgrass. The landscape became brittle. The sponge was gone, replaced by a sieve. By the late 20th century, these streams had become flashy. They would turn into violent, muddy torrents for 3 days during a storm, carrying tons of precious topsoil downstream to the Humboldt River, and then remain bone-dry for the rest of the year. This state of degradation created a vicious cycle. Because the soil was dry and the vegetation was sparse, the ground could no longer absorb rain. This led to more runoff, which led to more erosion, which deepened the gullies further. It was a desertification process that felt irreversible. For the ranchers who lived there, it meant the loss of forage for their cattle. For the fish, like the Lahontan cutthroat trout, it meant the loss of deep, cool pools and the death of their spawning grounds. The land was flatlining, losing its complexity and its ability to hold on to the one thing that makes life possible in Nevada: moisture. Human intervention attempted to fix this with hard engineering. We brought in yellow excavators, poured concrete weirs, and lined banks with riprap, giant piles of jagged rock, to stop the erosion. But these were static solutions for a dynamic problem. Concrete doesn't grow, it doesn't adapt to a changing climate, and it certainly doesn't heal itself when the spring floods come. These projects were expensive, often costing hundreds of thousands of dollars for a few hundred yards of stabilized bank, and they rarely addressed the underlying issue of the dropped water table. We were trying to act like engineers, but we lacked the 24/7 dedication of the original inhabitants. We treated the stream as a pipe to be fixed rather than a living system to be nurtured. The land sat in a state of arrested development, a dead desert, not because of a lack of rainfall, but because it had lost its capacity to remember the rain it did receive. The stage was set for a radical experiment, a realization that perhaps the most advanced technology we had was not a machine, but a mammal that had been doing the work for free for 10,000 years. But how do 5 small creatures reverse a century of geological decay? The engineer's blueprint. When the 5 beavers were released into the jagged, sun-scorched incision of Susie Creek, they didn't see a restoration site or a hydrological crisis. They saw a problem with home security. For a beaver, water is safe. On land, they are slow, waddling targets for coyotes and mountain lions. In the water, they are agile, sleek, and nearly untouchable. Their immediate biological imperative was to create a pool deep enough to hide in and cold enough to survive the Nevada summer. To do this, they began a process of soft engineering that no human hydraulic model could perfectly replicate. The beaver's primary tool is not just the dam, but the mastery of fluid dynamics. They do not build a single monolithic wall of concrete to stop the water. Instead, they build a series of leaky structures made of mud, willow branches, and sagebrush. In the context of modern restoration, these are known as beaver dam analogs, BDAs, but for the beavers, they are simply the foundation of a kingdom. Unlike a human-engineered dam, which is designed to be a rigid barrier, a beaver dam is a porous filter. It is designed to dissipate energy rather than resist it. As the beavers wedged the first branches of willow into the cobble of the creek bed, they began to manipulate the kinetic energy of the stream. In its degraded state, Susie Creek was a high-velocity fire hose. By placing sticks perpendicular to the flow, the beavers forced the water to navigate a labyrinth of obstacles. This created micro-turbulence, which immediately slowed the water's velocity. As the water slowed, it lost its capacity to carry sediment. The heavy silts and sands that had been scouring the stream bed for decades suddenly dropped out of suspension, settling behind the dam. This is the first miracle of the blueprint. The beavers weren't just stopping the water, they were using the stream's own cargo to rebuild the floor of the valley. Over months of tireless labor, the beavers layered mud over the stick skeletons of their dams. They used their broad tails and nimble paws to pack the plumbing of the structure. But they didn't stop at the main channel. Beavers are obsessive mappers of the landscape. They began to dig canals extending outward from the main pond into the dry sagebrush. These canals served 2 purposes. They allowed the beavers to float heavy wood back to the dam with minimal effort, and they acted as irrigation ditches. As these canals filled with water, they began to hydrate the interstitial spaces of the soil, the tiny pockets between grains of sand and dirt that had been dry for half a century. The physics of this transformation can be understood through the relationship between flow and pressure. In a straight, incised channel, the water pressure is concentrated downward, carving the trench deeper. When the beaver dam is introduced, the pressure is diverted laterally. The water is forced offline, pushing into the banks and spreading across the floodplain. This creates what hydrologists call a stepped profile. Instead of one long, steep slide, the creek becomes a series of terraces. Each terrace acts as a settling pond, a coolant, and a nursery. The complexity of these structures is staggering. A single beaver dam is rarely alone. They exist in complexes. If one dam is breached by a massive spring flood, the dams below it catch the debris and the energy, preventing a total blowout. This redundancy is something human engineers often struggle to fund or implement, yet the beavers provide it for the cost of a few willow branches. They are constantly patrolling the structure. If they hear the sound of running water, a sound that signals a leak and a drop in their pond level, they respond with an instinctive urgency to plug the hole. This 24/7 maintenance cycle is what makes their blueprint superior to any man-made intervention. The mud and sticks architecture also solves the problem of oxygenation and temperature. As water trickles through the porous dam, it is aerated, increasing the dissolved oxygen levels downstream. Simultaneously, the deep pool created behind the dam provides a thermal refuge. Because water has a high specific heat capacity, these deep ponds stay cool even when the Nevada sun is beating down at 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The beavers are essentially building a giant, self-maintaining air conditioning system for the aquatic ecosystem. Furthermore, the beaver's blueprint includes the manipulation of the vegetation itself. By coppicing the willows, chewing them down to the stump, they actually stimulate the plants to grow back thicker and more vigorously. It is a symbiotic relationship. The beaver needs the wood for the dam, and the act of taking the wood ensures that the willow remains young, flexible, and healthy. This creates a feedback loop of green growth that provides even more building material and more shade for the water. This engineering is not a static event, but a continuous negotiation with the landscape. As the ponds fill with sediment over the years, the beavers simply build the dam higher, or they move upstream and start a new one. Over time, this process plugs the gully. The deep 10-foot scar in the earth begins to fill with rich organic soil. The stream bed literally rises. This is the ultimate goal of restoration, to bring the water back up to the level where it can, once again, spill over the banks and reconnect with the historical floodplain. The beavers did not need a permit, a topographical map, or a government grant. They followed a blueprint, refined over millions of years of evolution. A blueprint that prioritizes resilience over rigidity and slow water over fast water. They transformed the fundamental geometry of the creek from a line into a web. They replaced the drain pipe with a reservoir. As the first year of their residency came to a close, the dead desert of Susie Creek was no longer a place where water just passed through on its way to somewhere else. The water was staying. It was soaking in, shifting the very chemistry of the earth beneath the beavers' feet. The true magic, however, isn't what happens on the surface, but what happens beneath the soil. The subterranean sponge. While the visible pools and the return of the willows offer a striking visual narrative, the most profound transformation triggered by the Nevada 5 occurred out of sight, beneath the soles of a hiker's boots. In an arid environment like the Great Basin, the surface water you see is merely the tip of a massive hydrological iceberg. To truly heal a desert, one must heal the subterranean sponge, the vast, porous layers of earth that act as the landscape's natural battery. Before the beavers arrived, this battery was completely drained. The incised gully of Susie Creek had acted like a surgical straw, sucking the moisture out of the surrounding land and leaving the water table buried so deep that even the most determined roots couldn't reach it. The moment the beavers completed their first primary dam, the physics of the valley began to invert. In a degraded stream, gravity is a destructive force, pulling water rapidly toward the lowest possible point and taking the soil with it. But when the beaver dam creates a pond, it creates hydrostatic pressure. The weight of the pooled water pushes downward and, more importantly, outward. This is known as lateral recharge. As the water level in the creek rose against the mud-packed walls of the dam, it began to seep into the banks, filling the ancient, dried-out pores of the alluvial soil. Think of the valley floor as a giant, desiccated sponge. For decades, this sponge had been brittle and hard, unable to hold a drop. The beavers began to prime the sponge. As the water moved sideways, it rehydrated the soil for hundreds of yards in either direction. This process is slow, a rhythmic, subterranean creeping, but its scale is gargantuan. For every gallon of water visible in a beaver pond, there are often 5 to 10 gallons stored invisibly in the ground surrounding it. This is the subterranean sponge in action, a massive, hidden reservoir that is protected from the brutal evaporation of the Nevada sun. In the high desert, evaporation is a thief. A surface lake can lose several feet of depth in a single summer to the dry air. But water stored in the earth, tucked between grains of silt and gravel, is safe. This underground storage is what allows the ecosystem to survive the lean months. In Nevada, the hydrograph is usually a spike, a massive surge of water in April and May when the snow melts, followed by a total flatline in August. By forcing water into the ground, beavers flatten the curve. They take that destructive spring surge and store it in the earth. Then, during the scorching heat of late summer, that stored water slowly bleeds back into the stream. This creates a perennial flow. Before the beavers, Susie Creek would often stop running entirely by mid-July, leaving only sun-baked rocks and dying fish. After the beavers re-established the sponge, the creek began to flow year-round. Even when no rain fell for 60 days, the bank storage provided a steady, cool base flow. The desert was no longer living paycheck to paycheck on rainfall. It finally had a savings account. The chemical composition of the land changed as well. When soil is bone dry for years, it loses its microbial life. It becomes dirt rather than soil. As the beavers rehydrated the valley, they reactivated the soil's biology. Anaerobic and aerobic bacteria began to thrive in the newly saturated earth. This subterranean life began to break down pollutants and process nitrogen. The beaver complex effectively became a massive underground water treatment plant. As the water moved through the soil, the earth filtered out impurities, ensuring that the water re-emerging downstream was cleaner and more mineral-rich than the water that entered the pond. This hydration also changed the structural integrity of the valley. Dry, incised banks are prone to slumping, massive chunks of earth falling into the creek and clogging it with sediment. Saturated banks, reinforced by the returning root systems of water-loving plants, become stable. The sponge has a structural memory. As it fills with water, the soil expands, literally lifting the valley floor. Over several years, the combination of sediment trapping on the surface and soil expansion underneath began to agrade the stream. The 10-foot-deep trench began to shallow out. The scar was healing from the bottom up. This subterranean shift is the silent engine of desert restoration. It explains why, even in years of extreme drought, the areas managed by beavers remain stubbornly, defiantly green. While the surrounding hillsides turn a crispy brown, the beaver-impacted zones stay vibrant. This isn't because the beavers are making more rain. It's because they are the only ones making sure the rain doesn't leave. They have turned the landscape from a transit zone into a destination. The impact of this sponge extends far beyond the immediate banks of the creek. As the water table rises, it reaches the root zone of native grasses and shrubs that haven't been seen in the area for a generation. This isn't just about the beaver's survival, it's about the hydration of an entire corridor. The subterranean sponge acts as a buffer against climate volatility. If the next winter brings half the usual snowpack, the savings account in the soil can carry the valley through to the next year. It is the ultimate insurance policy for a warming world. By the end of the second year, the 5 beavers had successfully pressurized the local aquifer. The dead desert was now a saturated wetland, hiding millions of gallons of life-sustaining moisture just inches beneath the surface. The foundation was set for a biological explosion that would catch the attention of the entire world. As the water stayed, the desert began to forget its name. The green explosion, biodiversity, and fire. When the subterranean sponge finally reached its saturation point, the landscape of Susie Creek didn't just change, it detonated into life. For decades, the area had been a monochromatic study in grays and browns, a muted palette of sagebrush and dust. But once the beavers had successfully elevated the water table, the desert's dormant seed bank was switched on. Seeds that had lain in the parched earth for 20 or 30 years, waiting for a signal that the drought was finally over, began to germinate. The result was a green explosion that transformed the valley into a lush emerald ribbon that was so vibrant it became visible from low Earth orbit. This wasn't merely an aesthetic shift, it was a total recalibration of the ecosystem's biological wealth. The first responders to this new hydration were the willows. Willows are the lifeblood of the high desert riparian zone, but they are incredibly sensitive to water depth. Within 2 seasons of the beavers' arrival, thickets of coyote willow and yellow willow began to surge along the newly formed shorelines. These weren't the spindly, stressed shrubs of the past. They were robust, flexible, and dense. This vertical structure provided something the desert had lacked for a century: shade. As the willows leaned over the beaver ponds, they created a canopy that dropped the water temperature by several degrees. In the brutal heat of a Nevada July, a few degrees is the difference between life and death for the La Hontan cutthroat trout. These rare native fish began to migrate back into the Suzy Creek system, finding sanctuary in the deep, cool beaver basements, the excavated areas at the bottom of the ponds where the water remains coldest. As the vegetation thickened, the trophic cascade began to accelerate. The willows attracted insects. The insects attracted migratory songbirds. Species like the yellow warbler and the willow flycatcher, which had abandoned these dead valleys decades ago, returned in staggering numbers. Their songs replaced the hollow whistle of the wind over the sagebrush. The beaver ponds themselves became nurseries for amphibians. Great basin spade's-foot toads and Columbia spotted frogs found the still, nutrient-rich waters of the ponds to be the perfect breeding ground, free from the scouring currents of the old, incised channel. Every square inch of the beaver complex was being utilized by a different life form, creating a high-density biological skyscraper in the middle of a flat, arid landscape. But the most unbelievable aspect of this transformation, the one that eventually caught the eyes of federal agencies and climate scientists, was the role of the beaver complex as a wet blazer. In the American West, wildfire is an ever-present shadow. As the climate warms, Nevada's fires have become larger, hotter, and more frequent. In a typical dead desert creek, a wildfire sweeps through the dry sagebrush and cheatgrass, incinerating everything in its path right down to the water's edge, because the banks are just as dry as the hillsides. However, the 5 beavers had inadvertently built a massive living firebreak. When the flames of a regional wildfire approach a beaver-managed complex, they hit a wall of moisture. Because the beavers have pushed water hundreds of feet into the banks, the vegetation in the valley floor is turgid, full of water and difficult to ignite. While the surrounding hillsides might be engulfed in a 1,000-degree inferno, the beaver ponds remain green. These areas serve as emergency rooms for wildlife. During a fire, deer, elk, and even small predators will flee the burning uplands and huddle in the beaver wetlands. The water doesn't just save the plants, it saves the genetic stock of the entire region's fauna. After the fire passes, these green refugia provide the seeds and the survivors necessary to recolonize the charred hillsides. The beavers, essentially, provide the backup drive for the ecosystem's data. This greening also created a massive shift in carbon dynamics. A dry desert gully is a carbon source. It releases carbon as organic matter dries out and blows away. A beaver-managed wetland is a carbon sink. The thick mats of sedges and the deep layers of anaerobic peat forming at the bottom of the ponds lock away atmospheric carbon for centuries. By simply letting 5 beavers walk into a dead desert, the state of Nevada had accidentally stumbled upon one of the most efficient carbon capture technologies on the planet. The explosion of life even extended to large-scale mammals. Mule deer and pronghorn began to frequent the creek more often, drawn by the high-protein forage of the wet meadows. The beavers' work had turned a starvation landscape into a buffet. The sheer volume of biomass produced in these few miles of creek was dozens of times higher than the surrounding desert. It was a localized reversal of the desertification process that is currently haunting much of the globe. The beavers had proved that the desert wasn't a fixed state of being, but a symptom of broken hydrology. Once the plumbing was fixed, the life was ready and waiting to reclaim its territory. This wasn't just a win for the wild. It was the start of an uneasy truce with the people who call this land home. The human-beaver nexus. The transformation of Susie Creek was an ecological triumph. But in the rugged social landscape of Nevada, biology must eventually reckon with culture. For decades, the beaver was viewed by the ranching community as a saboteur, a nuisance animal that blocked irrigation ditches, flooded precious access roads, and chewed through valuable timber. In a state where water rights are more valuable than gold, the idea of allowing a rodent to dictate the flow of a stream was, to many, an act of bureaucratic insanity. However, as the green explosion took hold, the narrative began to shift from one of conflict to one of pragmatic partnership. The turning point came when the ranchers noticed the resilience of their own herds. During the big dry years, when surrounding cattle ranches were forced to cull their herds due to lack of water and forage, the ranches surrounding the beaver complexes remained functional. The beavers had essentially extended the grazing season. By raising the water table, they had created sub-irrigated meadows that produced lush, high-protein grasses long after the rest of the range had turned to straw. The ranchers weren't just seeing more wildlife, they were seeing more pounds on their calves. This economic reality began to dissolve a century of animosity. This shift in perception necessitated a parallel shift in policy. Nevada's water laws, rooted in the 19th century doctrine of prior appropriation, were designed for a world of pipes and pumps, not ponds and dams. Advocates and land managers had to work tirelessly to reclassify beaver activity not as wasteful flooding, but as beneficial use of water. It was a slow-motion revolution in Western law. Agencies like the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, began to move away from expensive, heavy machinery interventions and toward low-tech process-based restoration. The math was undeniable. A $500,000 restoration project involving bulldozers could be wiped out by a single flood, but a colony of beavers provided a self-repairing workforce for the price of a few willow stems. Today, the human-beaver nexus in Nevada is defined by a new kind of coexistence infrastructure. To prevent the beavers from flooding roads, managers installed pond levelers, cleverly hidden pipes that allow the pond to reach a certain height before draining, tricking the beavers into thinking the dam is intact while protecting human assets. This technological compromise represents a maturing of the environmental movement, a move away from managing nature and toward partnering with it. The Nevada Five proved that the goals of the rancher and the goals of the river are actually the same. Both need the water to stay in the valley as long as possible. Both need the sponge to be full. This wasn't just a win for the wild. It was the start of an uneasy truce with the people who call this land home. The pioneer beavers. The 5 beavers released into the Susie Creek Basin didn't know they were pioneers. They were simply trying to build a home. Yet, their persistence proves that the most sophisticated technology for climate resilience isn't found in a laboratory, but in the instinct of a keystone species. We have spent billions trying to out-engineer nature, only to find that the desert's best hope was already waiting in the mud. The staggering transformation from a bone-dry, incised gully to a thriving, fire-resistant wetland serves as a living laboratory for the entire American West. As we look toward an increasingly arid future, the lesson of Nevada is clear. The dead desert is often just a landscape waiting for its architects to return. By restoring the beaver, we didn't just save a creek. We reactivated a planetary cooling system and a biological insurance policy. The legacy of those 5 original beavers is written in every willow thicket, every trout pool, and every gallon of water held tight by the Nevada soil. Sometimes, the most radical act of restoration is not to build, but to step back and let the locals lead the way. The Nevada 5 proved that a dead desert is often just a landscape waiting for its architects to return. By restoring the Beaver, we didn't just save a creek. We reactivated a planetary cooling system and a biological insurance policy. Their legacy is written in every willow thicket and every gallon of water held by the soil. To see more deep dives, just like how nature's smallest engineers are fixing our biggest problems, make sure to click on that subscribe button.